I drove up Route 13 every Friday evening after my shift ended, watching the failing October light bleed through the pine forests that crowded both sides of the highway. The county plow sat in the municipal lot until November, which meant I spent those autumn weeks doing maintenance checks on equipment, inventorying salt supplies, and generally killing time until the first snow gave me something real to do. 22 years with Ashland County road maintenance, and I'd learned to appreciate these slow months. My ex-wife Angela used to say I was wasting my life waiting for winter, but she'd never understood that some men are built for specific seasons. The cabin sat 40 minutes past town, down a 2-track road that turned to soup every spring and froze into ruts deep enough to snap an axle if you didn't know the line to take. My grandfather had built it in 1952, right after he came back from Korea, and my father had maintained it until his back gave out 5 years ago. Now it was mine. 40 acres of mixed hardwood and pine that backed up to the Chequamegon National Forest, surrounded by wilderness so deep you could walk for 3 days without crossing a paved road. The property had a natural spring, good drainage, and ridge lines that funneled deer movement like highways. My grandfather had known what he was doing when he picked this spot. I pulled up to the cabin as full dark settled in, the truck's headlights catching the peeling green paint on the door and the stack of split oak I'd covered with a tarp last month. The air had that particular October smell: decomposing leaves, pine sap, and the faint mineral tang of the creek that ran along the eastern property line. I killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, letting the week's accumulated noise drain out of my head. The radio dispatcher's voice, the grinding of the garage doors, the constant hum of fluorescent lights in the break room, all of it fell away up here, replaced by wind in the pines and the occasional call of a barred owl. I'd been making this drive since my divorce, 3 years back, sometimes more than once a week. Angela had gotten the house in Ashland and I'd taken the cabin, which was probably the only part of the settlement where we both felt like we'd won. She'd always hated it up here. The outhouse, the propane lamps, the hand-pumped water from the well. She wanted climate control and cable television and neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. I wanted the opposite of all that. I wanted to sit on the porch and not see another human light in any direction. Wanted to wake up to silence instead of traffic. Wanted to be alone with my thoughts without someone asking me what I was thinking about every 5 minutes. The cabin was 12 by 24 feet. One room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace. My grandfather had mortared himself, using rocks from the creek. I'd added a small woodshed and a covered porch over the years, and I kept it stocked with enough supplies to last a week without going to town. Canned goods, rice, flour, coffee, and a decent selection of whiskey for the cold nights. My bow hung on pegs above the door, and my grandfather's .45-70 lever action sat in the corner, oiled and loaded, though I rarely touched it. I preferred the bow for deer. Something about the challenge of getting close, the need for patience and wind reading and knowing the animal's patterns. This was peak rut season, mid-October, when bucks lost their minds chasing does and became careless enough for a patient hunter to get a shot. I'd been seeing good scrapes along the ridge line for the past 2 weeks. Fresh rubs on the saplings where bucks had torn up the bark with their antlers, marking territory and advertising their presence. The trails showed heavy traffic, and I'd set up 3 game cameras to pattern their movements. Tomorrow morning I'd be in my stand an hour before dawn, watching the crossing where the main trail dipped down to the creek. I'd taken a 9-point buck there 2 years ago, and the spot was perfect. Good wind, good sight lines, and a comfortable climbing stand I'd left in place year-round. Inside, I lit the propane lamps and got a fire going in the fireplace, more for light than heat. The cabin held warmth well once the stones got hot. I ate a cold sandwich from my cooler and drank 2 beers while I studied the topographic map I kept spread on the table, marking the spots where I'd found the freshest sign. My phone had no signal up here, which was another thing Angela had hated and I loved. No one could reach me. No one could ask me to cover a shift or fill out paperwork or explain why I'd put salt spreader number 4 back in service when it was scheduled for a full rebuild. I was just Lucian Valewood, 48 years old, alone in a cabin in the woods, exactly where I wanted to be. I climbed into the loft around 9 and lay in the sleeping bag, listening to the fire pop and settle. Through the loft window I could see stars scattered across a clear sky, more than you could ever see in town. The temperature would drop into the 30s tonight, which meant good hunting weather tomorrow. Cold enough to keep my scent down, clear enough to see. I thought about the 9-pointer, wondered if he was still alive, still cruising the ridge. Bucks that age were smart, but the rut made them stupid. Biology overrode caution, and that's when men like me had an advantage. I fell asleep thinking about arrow placement and wind direction, and I slept well, the kind of deep rest I never managed in town. Saturday morning I was in the stand before first light, bow across my lap, watching my breath frost in the beam of my headlamp. I killed the light as the sky began to gray in the east, letting my eyes adjust to the pre-dawn darkness. The woods were alive with sound. A pileated woodpecker hammering somewhere to the north, squirrels rustling in the leaf litter, a raven calling from the ridgetop. Normal sounds. Good sounds. The forest talking to itself the way it should. Except the deer never came. I sat in the stand until 10 o'clock, watching the light strengthen and the shadows shrink, and I didn't see a single deer. Not a doe, not a fawn, not even a glimpse of movement in the brush. The scrapes I'd found earlier in the week were still fresh. I could smell the musky scent from 40 yards away. But nothing moved along the trails. By noon, I'd climbed down and started walking the property, checking my patterns, trying to figure what had changed. That's when I noticed the silence. It came on gradually, so gradually I didn't recognize it at first. I was working my way along the creek, checking for tracks in the mud when I realized I couldn't hear any birds. The woodpecker had stopped. The ravens had gone quiet. Even the squirrels had disappeared. And squirrels were always present, always chattering and rustling and dropping pine cone scales from the branches. Now there was just wind and water, and the sound of my own boots in the leaves. I stopped walking and stood completely still, listening. Nothing. The forest had gone dead quiet in a way I'd never experienced. Not in 40 years of hunting these woods. My grandfather used to say that silence in the forest meant a predator was near, something big enough that the small things went still and waited for it to pass. But the only predators up here were black bears and the occasional wolf, and neither of those would create this kind of silence. Bears were noisy, crashing through brush without concern. Wolves might move quietly, but they didn't stop all sound for hundreds of yards in every direction. I remember thinking about the North Woods grizzly, a cryptid some of the old-timers talked about, Supposed to be a massive bear, bigger than black bears should get, aggressive enough to take down cattle. But that was bullshit. Campfire stories to scare tourists. There hadn't been grizzlies in Wisconsin for over a century. I was letting the silence get to me, letting my imagination fill in the gaps. Probably a weather front moving in, some atmospheric change that made the animals hunker down. Except the sky was clear, the barometer steady, and my gut was telling me something was wrong. I walked back to the cabin and checked the feeders my grandfather had installed near the clearing. 3 tube feeders that usually emptied twice a week from the chickadees and nuthatches and finches that mobbed them year-round. The feeders were full. Not a seed had been taken in days, maybe longer. I rattled one, and the sound seemed too loud in the silence, like I was announcing my presence to something that was listening. My hands were steady on the feeder, but my pulse was starting to climb. This wasn't right. Birds didn't just abandon feeders unless something had scared them off. And whatever that something was, it was still here. I spent the afternoon doing maintenance work I'd been putting off, patching the roof, replacing a rotted porch board, stacking more wood under the tarp. Physical work to keep my mind occupied, to push back against the growing unease that sat in my chest like a stone. The silence persisted. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed subdued. I should have been swatting black flies, but I didn't see a single one all afternoon. Around 4 o'clock, I walked the property line, checking the corners and making sure my posted signs were still visible. That's when I found the first trail camera ripped down. It had been mounted on a pine tree about 8 feet up, strapped with a heavy-duty cam buckle and secured with a padlock to prevent theft. The whole assembly was lying in the leaves. The mounting bracket bent like someone had grabbed it and yanked straight down with enough force to tear the tree bark. The SD card was missing, the battery compartment crushed flat. I stood there holding the broken camera, turning it over in my hands, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. A bear could have done it, maybe. If it had climbed the tree and swatted at the camera, gotten lucky with the angle. But bears didn't remove SD cards. Bears didn't bend steel brackets without leaving claw marks on the tree. And bears sure as hell didn't hit all 3 cameras in a single night. Because when I checked the other 2 locations, I found the same thing. Cameras torn down, brackets destroyed, cards missing. No evidence of what had done it beyond the sheer strength required to twist metal. I remember standing at the 3rd camera site, looking at the deep gouges in the tree trunk where something had dug in for leverage, and feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with the October temperature. Those gouges were fresh. Sap was still bleeding from the white wood underneath. Whatever had done this, it had done it recently. Maybe last night while I slept in the loft. Maybe this morning while I sat in the stand, waiting for deer that had already fled. I walked back to the cabin faster than I meant to, glancing over my shoulder every few yards, and I was breathing hard by the time I reached the porch. The silence pressed in from all sides, also thick and heavy, and for the first time since my grandfather had died, I felt like an intruder in these woods. Inside the cabin, I sat at the table and forced myself to think rationally about what I'd found. 3 trail cameras destroyed in a single night, the brackets bent like aluminum foil, the SD cards missing, the silence that had settled over the property like a blanket, the complete absence of deer, despite fresh sign less than a week old. I pulled out a notebook and started listing possibilities, trying to work through the problem the way I'd learned to diagnose mechanical issues. Eliminate the impossible. Narrow down the probable. Bears. Black bears were common enough in the Chequamegon, and they could be destructive when they wanted to be. But bears didn't climb 8 feet up a tree to destroy a camera when there was nothing edible nearby. Bears didn't carefully remove SD cards. And bears, even the big males that topped 300 pounds, didn't create this kind of sustained silence. I'd hunted around bears before. They moved through the forest like bulldozers, making noise, leaving sign everywhere. Whatever had taken down my cameras had done it efficiently, systematically, almost methodically. Wolves. The DNR kept saying there weren't any packs this far south, but wolves were expanding their range. Maybe a pack had moved in. Maybe they were territorial enough to clear out all the deer. But wolves didn't reach high enough to destroy cameras mounted 8 feet up, and they sure as hell didn't understand what an SD card was. I'd seen wolf kills before. Messy, violent, with scattered remains and tracks everywhere. There were no kills on my property, no blood, no scattered fur or bones. Just absence. Humans. That was the possibility that bothered me most. Maybe someone was poaching, running bait sites illegally, and they'd torn down my cameras to hide their activity. But I was 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, and Dale Kirshner was 76 years old with a replaced hip. He wasn't climbing trees to destroy cameras. The logging roads were gated this time of year, and I hadn't seen fresh tire tracks anywhere except my own 2-track. Besides, poachers didn't create silence. Poachers didn't make the birds stop singing and the squirrels disappear and the deer abandon their rut behavior. I sat there writing and crossing out possibilities until the light started to fail, and I was no closer to an explanation that satisfied me. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a simple answer, something obvious I was missing. The deeper part, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be prey, kept telling me to pack up and leave and not come back. I compromised by deciding to stay one more night, but I brought the .45-70 lever action down from the wall and loaded it with the 405 grain hard-cast rounds my grandfather had favored for bear. The rifle was old, a Marlin from the 1970s, but it was reliable, and it hit hard enough to stop anything that walked these woods. I set it next to the bed in the loft, told myself I was being paranoid, and made dinner on the propane stove. Canned chili and crackers and coffee so strong it made my teeth ache. Darkness came early in October, and with it came a fog that rolled up from the creek bottoms and settled over the cabin like something living. I stood on the porch and watched it come. Thick white tendrils that wrapped around the tree trunks and obscured everything beyond 20 yards. The silence continued. No owls calling, no mice rustling in the woodpile, no wind in the branches. Just the fog and the darkness and a cold that seemed to seep up through the floorboards. I went inside and lit all 3 propane lamps, suddenly wanting as much light as possible. The shadows bothered me, the way they pooled in the corners and seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I checked the door latch twice, made sure the windows were latched, and felt ridiculous for doing it. This was my cabin, my property. I'd spent hundreds of nights here alone and never felt anything like this creeping unease that made my skin prickle and my breath come shallow. Around 8 o'clock, I decided to make one more check of the property, just to prove to myself that nothing was out there. I took the heavy-duty flashlight from the shelf by the door, the one with the 1,000-lumen LED that could light up 100 yards, and stepped off the porch into the fog. The beam cut through the white murk in a solid shaft, illuminating nothing but more fog and the dark trunks of trees that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, moving slowly, sweeping the light in wide arcs. The fog swallowed sound the way snow did, muffling even my footsteps in the leaves. I could barely see the cabin behind me, just the yellow glow of the lamps filtering through the windows. Everything felt wrong, compressed, like the world had shrunk down to just the circle of my flashlight beam and nothing else existed beyond it. That's when I felt it, not heard it, not saw it, felt it. The sensation of being watched, so strong it made the hair on my neck stand up and my hand tighten on the flashlight. I stopped walking and stood completely still, barely breathing, listening with every part of myself. Nothing. Just the fog and the silence and the frantic hammering of my heart against my ribs. I turned slowly, sweeping the light in a full circle, and that's when I saw them. Eyes, 2 points of light reflecting back at me from the darkness beyond the fog, amber green and bright as coins catching the sun. They were positioned wrong, too high off the ground, maybe 7 feet up, too wide set for any deer or dog. They didn't blink, didn't move, just held steady while I stood frozen with the flashlight beam locked on them. My first thought was deer. Had to be deer. Maybe a big buck standing on higher ground or behind a log. But deer eyes reflected white or yellow, not that amber green color. And deer didn't stand that still when a light hit them. They either bolted or turned their heads, broke the reflection. These eyes just stared, unwavering, and I could feel the intelligence behind them, the awareness that made every primitive part of my brain scream danger. I remember trying to speak, trying to yell or make some kind of sound that would break the moment. But my throat had locked up, and all I could manage was a choked wheeze. The eyes held for maybe 5 seconds, long enough for me to register every detail, to burn that image into my memory where it would live forever. And then they were gone. Not turned away, not blinked out, just gone like someone had thrown a switch. I ran, not walked fast, not retreated carefully. Flat out ran back to the cabin with my boots slipping in the leaves and my breath tearing in my throat. I hit the porch at full speed, yanked open the door, and slammed it behind me hard enough to rattle the windows. My hands shook so badly, I could barely work the latch. And when I finally got it secured, I backed away and stood in the middle of the room, chest heaving, staring at the door like something might come through at any second. Minutes passed. 5, 10, I don't know. The lamps burned steady, the fire crackled in the fireplace, and nothing came through the door. Slowly, my breathing settled. The shaking in my hands faded to a tremor. I sat down at the table and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Eyes, I'd seen eyes. Probably a bear, had to be a bear, standing on its hind legs the way they did when they were curious or trying to get a better look at something. The height was right for a bear. The color was just a trick of the light, the way the fog scattered the beam and made everything look strange. Bears had reflective tapetum like any animal, and in the right conditions, with the right angle, the color could look off. That's all it was. A bear investigating the property, maybe drawn by the smell of my dinner or curious about the light. Except bears didn't stand that still. Bears didn't watch with that kind of focused attention. And the color was wrong, I knew it was wrong, even as I tried to convince myself otherwise. I'd spotlighted enough animals to know what their eyes looked like in artificial light, and those eyes hadn't belonged to any bear. I climbed into the loft with the .45-70 and lay in the sleeping bag fully clothed, boots still on, the rifle across my chest. Through the loft window I could see nothing but fog pressing against the glass, like something trying to get in. The silence outside was complete, absolute, the kind of silence that felt like a presence rather than an absence. I kept the flashlight next to my head and told myself I'd wait until morning and then drive to town and talk to the ranger station, get some official eyes on the property, maybe even call Fish and Wildlife about bears or wolves or whatever the hell was out there. But I knew I wouldn't, because saying it out loud, describing what I'd seen, would make me sound crazy. 2 eyes in the fog, wrong height, wrong color, and I ran like a scared child back to the cabin. They'd smile and nod and suggest I was spending too much time alone. Maybe seeing things that weren't there, maybe the isolation was getting to me. Angela had already said as much, and she'd been married to me for 12 years. A ranger who didn't know me would just think I was another jumpy hunter spooked by shadows. I didn't sleep. I lay in the loft and watched the fog move outside the window and listened to the silence, and somewhere around 3 a.m. I heard something walking around the cabin. Not the heavy crash of a bear or the light patter of a deer, but something in between. A measured, deliberate tread that circled the building twice before moving off into the woods. I gripped the rifle and didn't move and didn't breathe until the sound faded, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made those footsteps knew exactly where I was and was choosing, for reasons I couldn't understand, to leave me alone. Dawn came gray and cold, the fog still thick but starting to thin as the sun worked its way above the tree line. I climbed down from the loft with my muscles stiff and my eyes gritty from lack of sleep. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it. Door latched, windows secure, nothing disturbed. I made coffee with shaking hands and drank it, standing at the window, watching the fog burn off in patches. When there was enough light to see clearly, I forced myself to go outside and check the ground around the cabin. The leaves were too thick and dry to hold tracks, but near the woodshed, I found a place where something had pressed down hard enough to compress the leaf litter into the mud underneath. The impression was big, bigger than my boot, and it had a shape that didn't match anything I recognized. Elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the front edge, but configured wrong for a bear or a wolf. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to make it fit into something I understood, and failing completely. I drove into Mellon around 9, stopping at the ranger station that sat just off Highway 13 near the forest boundary. The building was small, just an office and a garage bay for equipment, and on Saturday mornings it was usually empty except for Ranger Kowalski, who pulled weekend duty on a rotating schedule. Her truck was in the lot, so I parked next to it and went inside. Sarah Kowalski was maybe 35, compact and efficient, with the kind of weathered face you got from spending most of your time outdoors. She'd been with the Forest Service for 6 years, and I'd talked to her a handful of times about trail conditions and permit questions. She looked up from her computer when I walked in and smiled the way people did when they recognized you, but couldn't quite place the name. Lucian Valewood, I said, saving her the effort. I've got property backing up to the forest, about 4 miles southwest of Ashland. Right, sure. Your grandfather's old place. What can I do for you? I hesitated, suddenly aware of how this was going to sound. I'm having some issues with an animal on my property. Something's been destroying my trail cameras and spooking all the game off. I was wondering if you'd had any reports of wolves in the area, or maybe a problem bear. She leaned back in her chair and shook her head. No wolves that far south, not that we've documented. We've got a couple packs up in Bayfield County, but they don't usually range this direction. As for bears, they should be thinking about denning up by now, getting ready for winter. You see any actual damage beyond the cameras? No. But the forest has gone completely quiet. No birds, no deer, nothing. It's like everything cleared out overnight. Kowalski's expression shifted into what I recognized as her professional reassurance mode. The face you put on when dealing with a concerned citizen who was probably overreacting. That can happen this time of year. Weather patterns change, food sources shift, animals move to different areas. The rut's winding down too, so the deer behavior changes. As for the cameras, bears will sometimes investigate anything new in their territory, especially if they're still building fat reserves before denning. They're curious animals. These cameras were 8 feet up, I said, and the mounting brackets were torn off, not clawed, like something grabbed them and yanked straight down. Bears can climb, and they're stronger than most people realize. A big male can pull down a small tree if he wants to. I could feel the conversation slipping away from me, turning into exactly what I'd feared. A ranger talking down a jumpy hunter. What about the silence? I've hunted these woods for 40 years, and I've never experienced anything like this. It's not natural. Did you check the weather? Sometimes a big pressure system moving in will make animals hunker down and go quiet. They can sense changes before we can. The barometer's been steady for 3 days. She gave me a sympathetic smile that made me want to punch the desk. Look, I understand this is unsettling, but honestly, it sounds like normal forest behavior to me. If you want, I can have someone swing by your property next week and take a look around, but I really think you're just seeing a temporary shift in animal patterns. It happens all the time. I stood there looking at her helpful, professional expression and realized I wasn't going to get anywhere. She thought I was being paranoid, maybe spending too much time alone, reading too much into natural events. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was letting the isolation get to me, letting my imagination turn a bear investigation into something sinister. Thanks, I said finally. If someone could check it out, that'd be good. Absolutely, I'll put it on the schedule. In the meantime, I'd recommend taking down any remaining cameras for a few weeks. Let whatever's investigating them lose interest and move on. And maybe consider staying in town for a bit, giving the property a rest. I drove back to the cabin thinking about what Kowalski had said, that I was probably just seeing normal forest behavior, letting my imagination run. 2 different people telling me basically the same thing. Maybe they were right. Maybe I needed to spend more time around other humans, less time in the woods, listening to silence and seeing eyes in the fog that could have been anything, could have been nothing. The fog had burned off by the time I got back, leaving the property bright and clear under a high blue sky. The silence continued, but in daylight it felt less oppressive, more like peace than threat. I spent the afternoon cutting firewood, working up a sweat despite the cold, and the physical labor helped quiet the anxiety that had been gnawing at my chest since last night. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that Kowalski was right, that I was overreacting to normal forest behavior, that the eyes I'd seen were Just a bear being curious, nothing more sinister than that. I made dinner as the sun set, eating on the porch and watching the shadows lengthen across the clearing. The temperature was dropping fast, probably down into the 20s tonight, and I could see my breath in the still air. I thought about heading back to town, about sleeping in my apartment for once instead of the loft. But that felt like giving in to irrational fear. This was my property, my cabin. I wasn't going to let shadows and silence chase me off. Around 8 o'clock, I walked to the outhouse, flashlight in hand, moving quickly in the cold. The small wooden structure sat 20 yards from the cabin, and my grandfather had built it solid enough to last decades. I'd replaced the door and the seat a few years back, but the frame was original. Heavy timber that didn't shift even in high winds. I was walking back to the cabin, scanning the tree line out of habit when I saw it. The shape stood between me and the cabin, maybe 30 yards away, backlit by the motion sensor light I'd installed over the porch. At first, my brain tried to process it as a tree, just another pine trunk in the darkness, but trees didn't have shoulders. Trees didn't shift their weight from one side to the other. Trees didn't turn their heads. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a profile that was all wrong for any animal I'd ever seen. The body was too upright, too human in its posture. But the head was elongated, canine, with what looked like pointed ears silhouetted against the light behind it. The shoulders were huge, hunched forward, and the arms hung too long, reaching past where its knees should be if it had knees like a human. But it didn't stand like a human. The legs were wrong, bent backward at an angle that suggested digitigrade locomotion, like a dog or a cat, walking on its toes rather than flat-footed. I froze completely, every muscle locked, my flashlight forgotten in my hand. The beam pointed at the ground, illuminating nothing but my own boots and the leaves around them. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch as the shape turned fully toward me. The motion sensor light caught the ridge of its spine, a line of darker fur or hair that stood up like a mohawk, and then it dropped. Not fell, dropped, deliberately to all fours, and the movement was so fluid and so wrong that my mind rejected it completely. Nothing that size should be able to move like that, shifting from bipedal to quadrupedal in a single smooth motion, and the sound it made when it landed on all fours was too soft, too controlled, like it weighed nothing at all despite its obvious mass. It stared at me for another second, and even though I couldn't see its eyes in the backlight, I could feel them. That same sensation of being watched, being evaluated, being measured by something with intelligence and intent. Then it turned and bounded into the tree line, and the sound of it moving through the underbrush faded in seconds, swallowed by the forest. I stumbled back to the cabin on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, dropped the flashlight twice before I got to the porch, and barely managed to work the latch with my shaking hands. Inside, I grabbed the .45-70 and climbed into the loft and sat with my back against the wall, rifle across my lap, staring at the door and waiting for it to open. It didn't. The night stayed quiet. The motion sensor light eventually timed out, and the darkness outside pressed against the windows like something solid. I sat there until my legs cramped and my back ached, and I told myself over and over that I hadn't seen what I thought I'd seen. It was a bear. Had to be a bear. A big male standing on his hind legs, and the angle of the light had distorted its shape, made it look larger and stranger than it was. Bears dropped to all fours. Bears bounded away when startled. That's what I'd seen. A bear. Except I knew it wasn't. I knew, in the deepest part of myself, that what I'd seen wasn't any animal that should exist in these woods. It was something else. Something that moved with purpose and intelligence. Something that had been watching me and circling my cabin and destroying my cameras. And it was still out there. The dawn came gray and cold, and I hadn't moved from my position against the loft wall. My legs had gone numb hours ago, and my shoulders ached from holding tension I couldn't release. When enough light filtered through the windows that I could see the clearing around the cabin, I finally climbed down from the loft, still gripping the point, 45-70, and checked every window before I worked up the courage to open the door. The motion sensor light housing hung at an angle, torn partially from its mounting bracket. Deep gouges scored the wood beside it, 4 parallel lines that had peeled back splinters like someone drawing a rake through soft earth. Soft. I stepped onto the porch and looked at those marks, and my hands started shaking again. The grooves were too deep, too deliberate. I pressed my palm against them and felt how smooth the wood was inside each channel, how uniform the spacing. These weren't claw marks from a panicked animal scrambling at a wall. These were made slowly, with control, like someone dragging their fingernails down a chalkboard just to hear you flinch. I found more around the cabin's perimeter. Long scratches at shoulder height, my shoulder height, on 3 of the 4 walls. Not random, evenly spaced, methodical, like something had walked the circuit of the building and marked it at regular intervals, claiming territory maybe, or leaving a message. The scratches on the back wall, the one that faced the deepest woods, were the deepest. I could have fit my thumb into some of those grooves. The woodshed was 20 yards from the main cabin, and I'd been meaning to restack the cords inside since September. I walked over there slowly, rifle ready, scanning the tree line every few seconds. The shed's door hung open, though I'd latched it 2 days ago. I remembered latching it. I specifically remembered checking it before I'd gone to bed on Friday night, because I didn't want raccoons getting in and nesting in the woodpile. I pushed the door wider with the rifle barrel and looked inside. The wood hadn't been disturbed. The cords were exactly as I'd left them, still neatly stacked against the back wall. But something had been in here. The smell hit me first. A thick, musky odor that reminded me of the bear den I'd accidentally stumbled across as a teenager, that combination of animal fur and old meat, and something else, something organic and wrong that made my sinuses burn. I backed away from the doorway, and that's when I saw them. The handprints. They were pressed into the dust on the wooden shelf that ran along the shed's interior wall, and I stopped breathing when I realized what I was looking at. The prints were huge, easily twice the size of my own hands, with 5 distinct digits. But the proportions were all wrong. The fingers were too long, too thick, and they ended in points where claws had pressed into the wood hard enough to leave small divots. The thumb was positioned wrong, set further back on the palm than a human thumb, and the palm itself was elongated, more like a paw than a hand, but with that same 5-digit configuration that spoke of dexterity and grip strength. I thought about those fingers working the latch on my cabin door the way I'd imagined it, and my stomach turned over. This thing had hands. It could manipulate objects. It could open doors. The tracks outside the shed told the same story the ones by the creek had told, except now I saw them in full daylight and couldn't deny what I was looking at. They measured 14 inches long, just like the others, with 5 toes that ended in claw marks. But these prints showed the full weight distribution, the way the creature's mass had pressed into the soft ground, and I could see the digitigrade structure clearly. The heel never touched down. It walked on the balls of its feet like a dog or a wolf, but the toes spread wide like fingers gripping the earth. I followed the tracks. I don't know why. Some part of me needed to understand what I was dealing with, needed to see where it had come from and where it had gone. They led from the tree line behind the cabin, circled the woodshed twice, approached the main cabin from 3 different angles like it had been testing approaches, and then returned to the forest heading northwest, toward the old fire break that ran for miles through the densest part of my property. The tracks were fresh, hours old at most, which meant it had been here circling my cabin, testing my defenses, while I'd sat in the loft, pretending I'd seen a bear. I went back inside and made coffee, because that's what you do when your hands won't stop shaking and you need to feel normal. The propane stove lit on the first try, and I stood there watching the blue flame and listening to the percolator bubble and trying to convince myself that I hadn't just spent the night being stalked by something that shouldn't exist. The coffee tasted like metal. Everything tasted like metal. I drank it anyway and tried to think through my options. I could leave, pack up the truck and drive back to Ashland and never come back. Sell the property site unseen and let it become someone else's problem. That was the smart play. That was what any reasonable person would do after seeing what I'd seen. But this was my grandfather's land. My land now. 4 generations of Valewoods had hunted these acres, and I couldn't just abandon it because something big had wandered down from the national forest and decided to mess with me. Maybe it would leave. Maybe this was territorial behavior, and once it figured out I wasn't a threat, it would move on to somewhere deeper, in the Chequamegon. Animals didn't stick around human habitation unless there was food, and I kept my garbage locked up tight and hadn't left anything outside that would attract predators. But those handprints in the woodshed kept surfacing in my mind, the way the fingers had spread across that dusty shelf, deliberate and careful, the way the scratches around the cabin had been placed at exactly my height, like something measuring itself against me. This wasn't an animal protecting territory. This was something else, something studying me. I spent Sunday doing busy work around the cabin, tasks that kept me moving and kept my hands occupied. I restacked firewood that didn't need restacking. I cleaned the gutters even though they'd been cleaned last month. I checked and rechecked the door latches, the window locks, the propane connections. The 4570 stayed within arm's reach the entire time, and I kept finding myself scanning the tree line, looking for that silhouette, those eyes. The forest stayed quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Nothing moved in the underbrush, and that absence of sound was worse than any noise would have been. It felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I found another camera destroyed that afternoon, one I'd mounted high in an oak tree along the eastern property line. This one hadn't just been ripped down, it had been dismantled. The casing was torn open, the circuit board ripped out, the lens shattered. The pieces were laid out on the ground below the tree in a rough line, almost like someone had examined each component before discarding it. The SD card was gone, just like the others. Standing there looking at those pieces, I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't random destruction, this was deliberate. Whatever this thing was, it understood what the cameras were, understood what they were for, and it was removing them systematically. It didn't want to be recorded. It didn't want evidence. That meant it understood the concept of evidence. I drove back to Ashland that evening earlier than usual before sunset, and I kept checking my rear-view mirror the entire way. The highway was empty, just me and the endless pine forest on both sides, and every shadow between the trees looked like it might be something standing there watching. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, my jaw ached from clenching it. I called Angela that night. I don't know why. We hadn't been close since the divorce, kept our interactions limited to the necessary business of property and taxes and the occasional awkward check-in. But I needed to hear another human voice, needed to talk to someone who knew me well enough to tell if I was losing my mind. Lucian? She sounded surprised. Everything okay? Yeah, fine. Just wanted to see how you were doing. It's 9:30 on a Sunday night. You never call this late. I stared at the television, volume off, images flickering across the screen. Been having some trouble at the cabin. Animal problems. What kind of animal problems? I wanted to tell her. Wanted to describe the silhouette, the tracks, the handprints in the dust. But I knew how it would sound. I'd been spending too much time alone up there, letting isolation warp my perception. She'd suggest I take a break, see someone, get my head right. And maybe she'd be right. Maybe that's exactly what I needed to do. Probably wolves, I said. Been tearing up my trail cameras. I thought wolves avoided people. Usually these ones seem aggressive. She was quiet for a moment. You sound stressed. When's the last time you took a real break? Not just weekend trips to the cabin, but an actual vacation? It's been a while. You should consider it. That place is beautiful, but it's also isolated. Too much time alone out there, it does things to your head. Yeah, maybe you're right. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important. Her job at the insurance company, her new apartment near the lake, the weather. Normal conversation, human connection. When we hung up, I felt better for about 10 minutes. And then the silence in my apartment pressed in, and I was back to checking the windows and making sure the door was locked. I went back to the cabin the following Friday against my better judgment. I'd spent the week telling myself I was being irrational, letting fear override common sense. I'd grown up in these woods. I'd spent hundreds of nights in that cabin, alone, without incident. One strange weekend didn't change 40 years of safe experience. But I brought extra ammunition this time. 2 full boxes of .45-70 cartridges, plus my grandfather's old 12-gauge pump shotgun that I'd kept in storage. I loaded both weapons before I even unpacked my gear, and I set them beside the bed where I could reach them without thinking. The weekend started quiet. Too quiet, the way it had been before, but nothing approached the cabin. No silhouettes in the motion sensor light, no tracks around the perimeter. I started thinking maybe the thing had moved on, found better territory deeper in the national forest. Maybe my presence had finally convinced it to leave. Saturday afternoon, I decided to check the far northwest corner of my property, near where those tracks had headed after leaving my cabin. There was an old hunting blind up there that my grandfather had built in the 70s, and I'd been meaning to check its condition for months. The walk was about 2 miles through dense hardwoods and pine, following a deer trail that had been there longer than I'd been alive. The blind was still standing, though the roof had partially collapsed under snow load from last winter. I spent an hour clearing debris and checking the support posts, and I was so focused on the work that I didn't notice when the forest sound stopped. It was the silence that finally broke through my concentration, that same oppressive quiet that made the air feel thick. I straightened slowly and looked around, and that's when I smelled it. That same musky odor from the woodshed, but stronger now, fresher, close. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, and saw it at the edge of the clearing about 40 yards away. Just standing there, partially concealed behind a massive white pine, watching me. But this time, I saw details. The snout emerged first from behind the trunk, and in the afternoon light I could see it clearly. It was elongated like a wolf's, maybe 10 inches from nose to eyes, but broader through the jaw, more powerful. The fur was dark brown, almost black, with lighter patches around the muzzle that looked gray or silver. The nose was black and wet, and when it tasted the air, I saw the lips pull back slightly from the teeth. The teeth were wrong. Too many of them, too large, with canines that extended well past the jawline when the mouth was closed. Not like any wolf or dog I'd ever seen. These were predators' teeth, designed for tearing and holding. And there were too many of them crowded into that elongated jaw. Then it leaned further from behind the tree, and I saw the hand. It gripped the trunk maybe 7 feet off the ground, fingers spread wide, and I could see every detail in the afternoon light. The hand was covered in the same dark fur as the face, but sparser on the palm, and I could see the dark skin underneath, leathery and thick. The fingers were long, easily 8 inches, with thick knuckles and that same wrong proportion I'd seen in the prints. Each finger ended in a black claw that curved slightly inward, sharp and thick as rose thorns, and they gripped the bark with casual strength that peeled away strips of the tree's outer layer. The thumb was positioned too far back, giving it a grip that looked both human and canine, and I watched those fingers flex against the trunk, testing their purchase, and I understood with complete certainty that this thing could climb, could move through the trees if it wanted, could come at me from any direction, any angle. It tilted its head, and the movement was so dog-like and so wrong at the same time that my throat closed up. The ears, pointed and mobile like a German shepherd's, swiveled forward, focusing on me with an intensity that made every hair on my body stand up. Then it stepped fully from behind the tree. The shoulders were massive, humped with muscle that bunched and shifted under the fur as it moved. The chest was barrel-shaped but elongated, more like a human's torso than an animal's, and I could see the outline of ribs beneath the fur. The arms hung past its knees, and watching them swing as it shifted its weight made my brain hurt, because the motion was too fluid, too controlled, too intelligent. It stood there on 2 legs, but with that digiti grade stance that looked perpetually ready to drop to all 4s, and the muscles in its thighs were so pronounced I could see them flexing through the fur. The legs bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs, but they were positioned under the body like a human's, creating this hybrid locomotion that shouldn't be possible. And the eyes. Christ, the eyes. They held that same amber-green glow, catching the light with a reflective quality that seemed almost bioluminescent. But in the daylight, I could see the intelligence behind them. These weren't animal eyes. There was something looking out from behind those eyes that was aware and thinking and evaluating, and when they fixed on me, I felt like I was being measured for something I couldn't understand. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to categorize it: bear, wolf, person in a costume. But every attempt failed because this thing was none of those and all of those at the same time. Then it made a sound, not a growl or a bark or anything I could have expected. It was a low, resonant huff that came from deep in its chest, and the sound carried across the clearing with a weight that I felt in my sternum. The huff was followed by a clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, and I realized it was making that sound with its teeth, snapping them together in a pattern that felt like communication. It was talking to me, or at it, or something. My paralysis broke, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the blind's collapsed roof. And when I looked up again, the thing was gone. Just vanished, back into the trees, like it had never been there at all. But I could hear it moving, circling around the clearing, and the sound of branches breaking under its weight told me it wasn't trying to hide its presence anymore. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Left my tools, left everything. And I crashed through the underbrush back toward the cabin, and I could hear it pacing me off to my left, staying parallel to my path, but never quite showing itself. Every few seconds I'd hear that huffing sound again, and the clicking and branches snapping as it moved through terrain that should have been too dense for something that size to navigate. I burst into the cabin clearing doing maybe 15 miles an hour, all panic and no thought. And I didn't stop until I was inside with the door barred and both weapons in my hands. My chest heaved and my vision swam with black spots, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for most of that run. The forest outside went silent again. No movement, no sounds, just that oppressive quiet that felt like pressure against my eardrums. I moved to the window and looked out at the clearing, and I saw it standing at the tree line, just standing there, watching, making no attempt to hide anymore. It stayed there until the sun went down, and I stayed at the window with the rifle, and neither of us moved. When darkness finally came, it turned and walked into the forest, and I heard it moving around the cabin throughout the night, circling, testing, learning. I understood then that I wasn't dealing with an animal. This was something that thought, that planned, that understood cause and effect, and it had decided I was worth its attention. I was being hunted. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I sat in the wooden chair I'd dragged to face the door, the 45-70 across my lap, and my grandfather's .357 revolver on the small table beside me, loaded and within easy reach. The propane lamp hissed on the counter, throwing shadows that jumped and twisted with every flicker of the flame, and I watched those shadows for hours, waiting for one of them to move wrong, to separate from the wall and become something solid and terrible. The thing circled the cabin. I could hear it moving through the darkness outside, its footfalls heavy enough to make the floorboards vibrate when it passed close to the walls. Sometimes it would stop, and I'd hear that clicking sound again. Teeth snapping together in patterns that my exhausted brain kept trying to interpret as language. Then it would huff, that deep, resonant sound that I felt more than heard, and move on to test another section of wall. Around 2 a.m, it started pushing against the logs, not clawing or scratching, but pressing with what felt like systematic purpose, like it was checking the structural integrity of every joint and seam. I could hear the wood groaning under the pressure, and I found myself doing mental calculations about how much force it would take to collapse a wall, how thick the logs were, how well my grandfather had chinked them back in the 50s. The calculations didn't help. Nothing helped. I just sat there with sweat running down my face, despite the cold, my finger resting along the trigger guard of the rifle, and I listened to something that shouldn't exist. Test the walls of my cabin like a contractor evaluating a demolition job. At one point, it came to the window beside the door, the one I'd been looking out of earlier, and I saw its silhouette against the glass. The shape of the head, that elongated muzzle, and those pointed ears filled the entire window frame. I could hear its breathing, slow and measured, and I watched condensation fog the glass in rhythmic patterns. It stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just breathing and looking in, and I had the terrible certainty that it could see me just fine, that it knew exactly where I was sitting and what weapons I held and how scared I was. Then it did something that made my bladder nearly let go. It raised one of those massive hands and pressed it against the glass, palm flat, fingers spread wide. The hand was easily twice the size of mine, the pads on the palm and fingers dark and calloused, the claws extending past the fingertips like black daggers. It held the hand there, motionless, and I understood with sick certainty that it was showing me something, demonstrating. This is what I have, it seemed to say. This is what I could do if I wanted. The glass creaked under the pressure but didn't break. After a long moment, the hand withdrew, and the silhouette moved away from the window. I heard it walk around to the back of the cabin toward the bedroom, and the footfalls were measured and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. The testing continued until about an hour before dawn. I could tell when sunrise was coming because the quality of darkness outside the window started to change, black fading to deep blue, and the forest began to wake up. Birds started calling, tentative at first, then with more confidence, and I heard the usual morning sounds filtering back in. Pine branches rubbing together in the wind, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant sound of the creek running over rocks. The thing's footsteps moved away from the cabin back toward the tree line, and I heard it retreat into the forest. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for darkness again. I sat in that chair until full daylight, until I could see clearly out the windows and verify that nothing was standing at the tree line watching. Then I stood on legs that had gone mostly numb, set the rifle carefully on the table, and walked to the sink to splash water on my face. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the pump, and when I looked at my reflection in the small mirror above the basin, I didn't recognize the person looking back. My face was gray, eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles, and I'd aged about 10 years overnight. I knew I couldn't stay another night. Knew it with absolute certainty. Whatever that thing was, it had been patient so far, testing and watching and evaluating. But patience had limits. And I had the terrible feeling that tonight would be different, that it had learned what it needed to learn, and tonight it would stop testing and start acting. I moved through the cabin gathering essential items, wallet, keys, my heavy coat. Left everything else. The rifles came with me, one in each hand, and I backed toward the door while watching the windows. My truck was parked 30 yards from the cabin, and 30 yards had never seemed like such an impossible distance. I opened the door slowly, rifle raised, scanning the clearing. Morning sunlight slanted through the pines, and everything looked normal, peaceful, exactly like it had looked 100 times before. But normal was a lie now. I knew that. The woods had changed, or I had changed, or something fundamental about the relationship between me and this place had shifted, and it could never go back. I started toward the truck, walking backward for the first few steps, then forcing myself to turn and move faster. Every muscle in my body was tensed for the sound of something rushing from the trees, for the moment when I'd feel those claws sink into my back. But I made it to the truck without incident. Got the door open, threw the rifles inside, climbed in behind the wheel. The engine turned over on the first try, and I'd never been so grateful for a reliable machinery in my life. I got the truck turned around and started down the 2-track that led to the county road, driving too fast, bouncing over ruts that would probably wreck my suspension, and I didn't care. I just needed distance. Needed to be away from here. I made it maybe a quarter mile before I saw it standing in the middle of the road. The thing was positioned right where the track curved around a massive oak, and it stood on its hind legs at full height. And in the morning light, I saw it completely for the first time. Every detail, every horrible detail. I slammed on the brakes, and the truck fishtailed on the loose dirt, nearly sliding into the ditch, and I fought the wheel to keep it straight. When the truck stopped moving, maybe 20 feet separated us, and the thing stood there motionless, and I got my first clear look at what had been circling my cabin all night. It was 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. The body was covered in dense fur that was almost black, dark enough to appear as solid shadow from a distance. But up close I could see the individual hairs were dark brown with black tips, creating a layered appearance like rough shingles. The fur was shorter on the muzzle and longer around the neck and shoulders, forming that ruff I'd glimpsed before, and the texture looked coarse and thick, nothing like the sleek pelt of a wolf. The head was massive and distinctly canine, with a long muzzle that was broader than a wolf's, more like a dire wolf from prehistoric times. Something built for crushing power rather than precise killing. The nose was black and wet, and I could see the nostrils flaring as it scented the air. The ears stood erect and mobile, constantly swiveling and adjusting, triangulating sounds I couldn't hear. And the eyes. Those predator's eyes that reflected the morning light with an intensity that made them seem to glow from within. That same unnatural color I'd first seen in the fog. But it was the body that truly broke my brain. The torso was elongated and barrel-chested, ribs visible beneath the fur when it breathed, and the posture was upright like a human's but with a forward lean that suggested it could drop to all fours at any instant. The shoulders were grotesquely muscled, bunched and humped like a grizzly's, and the arms hung down past the knees, terminating in those hands I'd seen pressed against my window. Each hand had 5 fingers, 4 in front, and 1 thumb positioned far back, and the fingers were long and dexterous, tipped with claws that curved slightly inward. I could see the calluses on the palm, could see the joints flex as it slowly clenched and unclenched its fingers. The legs were digitigrade like a dog's, bent backward at the knee, but they were positioned under the body to support upright locomotion. The thigh muscles were so pronounced they looked like they'd been carved from wood, and the lower legs were covered in shorter fur that revealed the tendon structure beneath. The feet were elongated, more paw-like than the hands, with 4 toes and a dew claw set high on the ankle. But even the feet had a functionality that looked too human, too deliberate. And the tail. Christ, I hadn't noticed the tail before. It was long and thick, hanging down to about mid-calf, covered in the same dark fur as the body, and as I watched it, swayed slightly from side to side, creating a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The thing stood there in the middle of the road and watched me through the windshield, and its expression, if you could call it that, was one of calculation. Not aggression, not hunger, but cold evaluation. Like it was trying to decide something about me, weighing options, making choices based on criteria I couldn't begin to understand. I reached slowly for the rifle on the seat beside me, moving with the deliberate care you'd use around a dangerous animal that hadn't yet decided to attack. My fingers closed around the stock, and I brought the weapon up across my body, resting the barrel on the edge of the open driver's window. The thing watched me do this, watched me aim, made no move to dodge or retreat. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Me behind the wheel, with the rifle pointed at its chest, finger on the trigger, wondering if I could even bring myself to fire. It standing in the road, motionless except for that slowly swaying tail and those mobile ears tracking every sound in the forest around us. Then it moved. Not toward me, away. It turned with a fluid grace that shouldn't be possible for something that size, dropped to all fours in a motion so smooth it looked rehearsed, and loped off into the forest on the left side of the road. On all fours it moved like a wolf, like a bear, like something that belonged in the woods, and within seconds it had vanished into the undergrowth as if it had never been there at all. I sat there for another full minute, shaking so hard my teeth chattered before I convinced my foot to press down on the accelerator. I drove the rest of the way to the county road at walking speed, expecting it to appear again at every turn. But I made it to pavement without another encounter. Then I drove. Didn't head toward Ashland, didn't go home. I just drove, taking random turns, following highways without thought or destination, and I ended up in Hayward around noon. Found a motel called the Pines Inn, paid cash for a room, carried my rifles inside in a guitar case I kept in the truck, and locked the door behind me. Then I slept. Passed out like someone had hit me with a hammer, and I didn't wake up until the next morning. When I did wake up, I spent about 10 minutes dry heaving over the toilet, my body trying to purge something that couldn't be purged, some fundamental wrongness that had taken up residence in my mind. I stayed in that motel room for 4 days, called in sick to the county, told them I had the flu, which wasn't entirely a lie. I felt sick, felt like something inside me had broken and wasn't healing right. I'd watch television without seeing it, eat food without tasting it, and every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those hands pressed against my window, those glowing eyes watching me through the windshield. On the 5th day, I drove back to the cabin. Had to. Needed to see it in daylight, needed to verify that what happened had actually happened, that I hadn't experienced some kind of psychotic break brought on by isolation and grief over my grandfather's death. The drive took 2 hours, and I spent the entire time trying to convince myself that I'd find everything normal, that the cameras would show nothing, that the tracks would be gone. The cabin was still standing. That was good. Nothing appeared damaged from the outside. No claw marks on the walls. No evidence that anything unusual had occurred. But when I opened the door and stepped inside, I could smell it. That musk I'd detected in the tree stand, thick and organic and wrong. The smell had permeated everything, soaked into the furniture and the curtains, and I knew immediately that I'd never be able to sleep here again. I packed quickly, grabbed my important documents from the fireproof box, my grandfather's hunting knife, a few photos, left everything else. The furniture, the dishes, the mounted deer head above the fireplace. All of it could stay. I wasn't coming back. On my way out, I checked the area where the thing had stood in the road. Found tracks in the soft dirt, pressed deep by massive weight. And I took photos with my phone, documenting what I'd seen. Then I drove away from the property and didn't look back. I didn't report it. That might seem crazy, might seem irresponsible, but I thought it through and made a conscious choice. Who would I report it to? The sheriff? Fish and Wildlife? What would I tell them? That I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist? Something that stood 8 feet tall and had hands like a human and walked on 2 legs? They'd think I was insane, or drunk, or looking for attention. And even if they believed me, even if they took me seriously, what then? They'd send people into the woods, hunters, wildlife officials, maybe even the media. And I knew with absolute certainty that would end badly. Not for the thing, for them. Because here's what I understood after 4 days of thinking about nothing else. That thing had let me live. It had circled my cabin all night, had tested the walls, had pressed its hand against my window, and then at dawn it had stood in the road and watched me drive away. It could have killed me at any point. Could have come through the door or the windows. Could have caught me during my panicked run from the tree stand. Could have attacked while I was getting in my truck. But it didn't. It made a choice, showed itself completely, made sure I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and then let me go. Why? I don't know. Maybe I wasn't worth the effort. Maybe it was satisfied with just scaring me off its territory, or maybe it was something else, some alien reasoning I couldn't begin to comprehend. But I knew that if I sent people into those woods looking for it, it wouldn't show them the same mercy. They'd be hunters, carrying guns, full of confidence and human arrogance, and they'd die. I was certain of it. The thing had been patient with me, had given me chances to leave, but it wouldn't give chances to people who came looking for a fight. So I kept quiet. Told no one except Angela, and even then I kept the details vague. Said I'd had a scare, that some large animal had been around the cabin, that I'd decided it wasn't safe to stay out there alone anymore. She suggested counseling, said the divorce and my grandfather's death had been traumatic, and maybe I was processing grief in unhealthy ways. I let her believe that. It was easier than the truth. I listed the property for sale in November. Took a significant loss to a timber company that asked no questions about my eagerness to sell 40 acres of prime hunting land at below market value. They sent an agent to look at the cabin, and he called me that evening to say he'd gotten spooked while walking the property line. Said the woods felt off somehow, but they'd still honor their offer. I signed the papers a week later and walked away from the place that had been in my family for 3 generations. The county let me go in December. Said they were downsizing due to budget cuts, but I think they'd noticed something was wrong with me. I'd become unreliable, calling in sick too often, showing up late, staring off into space during shift meetings. I didn't fight it. Took my severance and started looking for work in Green Bay. Found a warehouse job after the new year. Forklift operator, day shift. Inside work surrounded by people and fluorescent lights that never went out. The work is mindless and repetitive, and exactly what I need. I show up, move pallets from point A to point B, go home. No creativity required, no decision making, just the simple mechanical task of operating machinery and following instructions. I moved to Green Bay in February, got a second-floor apartment in a complex off Oneida Street that's surrounded by other buildings, street lights, traffic noise. The opposite of isolation, the opposite of silence. I can hear my neighbors through the walls, their televisions, their arguments, their footsteps in the hallway. And I find that comforting in a way I never would have before. Human sounds, human presence, proof that I'm not alone. Angela and I meet for coffee once a month now. She lives in Appleton, halfway between Green Bay and where I used to live, and we meet at a Starbucks off of 41. We talk about nothing important. Her job at the insurance company, my warehouse work, whether we should sell the old house we still jointly own. She's mentioned dating someone, a guy from her office, and I told her that's good, that she should move on. We're friendly in a way we never were when we were married, and I think it's because there's no expectation anymore, no pressure to be anything other than two people who used to know each other well. She doesn't ask about the cabin. I think she knows that subject is closed, that whatever happened out there changed something fundamental about me, and she's kind enough not to press. Sometimes I catch her looking at me with concern, like she's worried I'm going to fall apart, but I always smile and change the subject, and eventually she lets it go. I adopted a dog in March, found him at the Humane Society, a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Bear, who'd been surrendered by his previous owner for behavioral issues. The issues turned out to be that he barks at everything and refuses to be left alone, which suited me fine. I wanted a dog that would alert me to anything unusual, and Bear has proven himself an excellent alarm system. He sleeps across the bedroom doorway every night, and if I get up to use the bathroom, he follows me, and I've never been more grateful for another living creature's neurotic attachment. I don't hunt anymore. Sold all my gear except my grandfather's .45-70 and the .357, which I keep in the bedroom closet, loaded and ready. I don't go into the woods at all, actually. The city parks are fine, the walking trails that are always populated, but anything more isolated than that makes my heart rate spike, and my hands start to sweat. Angela suggested hiking once, said it might be therapeutic, and I had to excuse myself to throw up in the restaurant bathroom. I sleep poorly. Average about 4 hours a night, and that's with medication. The dreams aren't always about the thing itself. Sometimes they're just about being watched, about feeling eyes on me in the darkness, about hearing that clicking sound echo through empty rooms. I wake up checking the windows, making sure the locks are engaged, and Bear has learned to come over and press his head against my leg until I calm down. Work helps. The routine, the structure, the mindless repetition of moving pallets and updating inventory. My coworkers think I'm quiet, maybe a little odd, but I'm reliable and I don't cause problems, so they leave me alone. I eat lunch in my car, listen to talk radio while I work, go home, and watch television until I'm tired enough to risk sleep. I tried dating once. Met a woman at the grocery store. She seemed nice. We went to dinner. But when she suggested we go to her place afterward, I panicked, made some excuse, and left. And I haven't tried since. The thought of being responsible for someone else's safety, of bringing someone into my life who might become a target, was too much. Because I don't know if the thing stayed at the cabin. Don't know if it's tied to that specific location or if It could follow me here, could find me in the city. Sometimes I wonder if I should have reported it. If my silence makes me complicit, if it hurts someone else, kills someone else. But then I remember the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate way it moved, the choice it made to let me live. And I convince myself that it's not hunting humans, that it has its territory and it defended it. And as long as people stay away from that specific patch of forest, they'll be safe. I tell myself that. I have to. The timber company sent me a letter last month. They're planning to log the property this summer, clear-cut the entire 40 acres. They wanted to let me know as a courtesy, since I'd been the previous owner. I almost called them, almost warned them. But what would I say? Don't cut those trees because something lives in them that shouldn't exist. They'd laugh me off the phone. Instead, I sent an anonymous email to the ranger station in Mellon. Said I'd heard reports of wolf activity in that area and suggested they do a survey before any logging occurred. I don't know if they'll take it seriously. Probably not, but at least I tried. It's been 18 months now since that last morning in the road. 18 months of city life, of warehouse work, of sleeping with lights on and a dog across the doorway. Angela says I seem better, more stable, and maybe she's right. The nightmares have decreased in frequency. I can make it through most days without thinking about it. Almost feel normal sometimes, but then night falls, and I'll be walking bare around the apartment complex, and I'll see the woods at the edge of the property, that line where street light gives way to darkness, and I'll remember. Remember those inhuman eyes watching from the shadows. Remember the sound of breathing on the other side of my window. Remember those massive hands pressing against the glass. And I'll wonder if it remembers me too. Wonder if it's still out there at the old property, watching the cabin stand empty, waiting for the next person who thinks they can live in its territory. Or if maybe it moved on, found new hunting grounds, new places where the prey doesn't know enough to be afraid. I don't have answers. Don't know what it was or where it came from or why it exists. Don't know if there are others like it or if it was unique, a singular anomaly in the natural order. Part of me hopes it was unique, because the thought of multiple things like that existing in the world is too much to process. But another part of me suspects that's naive, that the forests are full of things we don't understand, things that move through the shadows and watch us from the tree lines and make choices about whether we live or die. What I know for certain is this: I survived something I shouldn't have, was shown something that exists outside the boundaries of what we accept as real. And it changed me in ways I'm still discovering, in ways I'll probably be discovering for the rest of my life. I know that I can't go back to those places, can't trust the woods or the silence or the feeling of isolation that used to bring me peace. I know that I'll spend the rest of my life in well-lit spaces, surrounded by people, keeping my back to walls and my eyes on exits. I know that I'll never hunt again, never camp, never spend a night in any place where something might be watching from the darkness. And I know that somewhere in northern Wisconsin, in 40 acres of pine and hardwood that backs up to the Chequamegon National Forest, something walks on two legs and thinks with an intelligence we don't acknowledge, and it's still there, and it's waiting. You don't go back to those places. You don't speak their names. You don't warn people because they won't believe you anyway, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe the world works better when certain things remain unknown, when certain boundaries stay uncrossed. I just survive. Keep my head down, work my shifts, walk my dog in daylight hours, and try not to think too hard about what I saw. Try not to wonder if it thinks about me, if it remembers the man who stumbled into its territory and lived to walk away. Try not to wonder if our encounter really is over, or if it was just the beginning of something I don't yet understand. I survive. That's all. That's enough. It has to be.